I would like to welcome everybody here. My name is Femi Taiwo, and I'm chair of Africana and moderator for today's proceedings. This event has particular resonance for me, not just as Africana faculty, but also as a scholar, of Africana, of philosophy, of political thought, and a student of history. Now, all these things come together in the theme of today's discussion on historically black colleges and universities in the American higher education landscape. Yes, we talk about the American higher education landscape, but I hope that part of the conversation today, especially from our panelists, will branch out into the global education landscape, because my familiarity with HBCUs did not begin when I came to this country. It actually began before I entered university in Nigeria, reading the autobiography of Nnamdi Azikiwe, and reading about Kwame Nkrumah, and his sojourn, and reading about the former president of Malawi, Dr. Kamala Harris. When you begin to put all those together, you have some idea of where this landscape was and how wide, how global, it is. So this has particular resonance for me, and of course, to be colleagues with people who are products of those colleges also in person, and whose scholarship continue to shape how the world thinks about reality. Notice I didn't say about black people. How the world thinks about reality, about history, about what it is to be human, about how we conduct ourselves to one another, says a lot about the continuing impact of the institutions about which we're going to be informed today. So without further ado, I'll call on my colleague and the chair of the programming committee, Professor Nnamdi Azikiwe, to introduce our speakers. I thank you all for coming, and I really look forward to this conversation.
Okay, thank you so much. Each of us has a particular connection to the topic. So some of the things you have said are true for me. And when I came to Cornell, I adapted the course I was teaching in a doctoral program, innovations in education across the globe. But when I came here, I decided to focus on Africa and the African diaspora. And when I see today's graduate of those institutions, having studied them from how they started, is always amazing for me. So I'm really pleased that we can bring it together. We have another dimension coming in the spring semester. So this is just to warm you up. Okay. I'm a member of the committee, the programming committee, with Professor Richardson and Professor Taoli Goff, who's on leave. And during her absence, the chair stepped in. So he's wearing many as he sits there. So on our collective behalf, I would like to thank you all, and thank Dana and the whole main office for supporting us in the process of organizing this. This is our first attempt to bring people face to face, at least half a face for now, because we had very successful colloquium series in the spring. We were so enthused, and we decided to bring it to this semester, and we did one last month that was on fitness mental fitness for all. We did it in dual mode. And we decided to try the face-to-face. So this is our very first face-to-face event. So we thank you for joining us. I will introduce the speakers. If you saw the poster, there was another panelist, Professor Derek Spies, who was to be here, but yeah, showing. Wow, what a teamwork. Okay, hold it up. Okay. However, he had to take a trip, and he regrets really profoundly not to be here because he was going to bring us a very interesting dimension to Gallup College and also the UNCF Melon. UNCF stands for United Negro College Fund. So he would have brought here a very, very enriching experience, but he can't, he won't arrive. He's coming, but he won't be back on time. So he wants me to share with you his regret, and so we'll catch him next time. So I'm going to introduce the three speakers. Line up there. And Professor Ann Adams, Professor Boyce Davis, Professor Richardson, and each of them will speak for 15 minutes. And after that, we will have a conversation, and the conversation will be concluded with Professor Taiwo, the chair of the Africana department. So, it's going to take even if it was made short, it's going to take a little bit of the time introducing these powerful speakers. So it's a joy for me, an honor, to present these three wonderful colleagues, powerful, inspiring colleagues, and who welcomed me here, and Professor Boyce Davis. We collaborated while she was in Binghamton, and more recently, Professor Richardson. So we have a whole different generation of Africana scholars who are sitting here today. Professor Ann Adams. Professor Ann Adams graduated from Fisk, same university as W.E.B. Du Bois. People mention Harvard, but before Harvard there was Fisk. Okay, so from Fisk University in 1963 with a major in German and minor in French and Spanish. From Fisk, she went to Free University of Berlin. She followed a little bit Du Bois in Berlin.
Yes.
German.
Different university.
Yeah, it's
Berlin.
a country. Yeah, the tradition. Yeah, Humboldt and all that. Okay, so she went to Berlin on a Fulbright grant and remained 2 further years teaching at a bilingual German-American school. Then graduate work at the University of Michigan, ultimately completing the PhD in German in 1977. In between, there were stints in West Africa as a language consultant, not German, because the Germans were not successful in remaining in Africa, as you know. For the Peace Corps, and her dissertation subject in the area of the Caribbean Creole and folklore allowed her to bring together linguistics of European languages with African and diaspora history and culture. Forgive me for my commentary, it's too tempting to just read. Okay. Before coming to Cornell in 1982, Professor Adam had taught at Morehouse College, an HBCU also, and at Kent State University. At Cornell, in 1982 to 2006, she taught African and diaspora literature, research and publication, and that have focused on two areas: the women's writing of Africa and the diaspora, from which came the collaboration with Professor Carol Boyce Davis on Ngambika, studies of women in African literature. In addition to Professor Adams' other edited books on African women writers, there is also the Afro-German Cultural Studies, from which came, among other publications, her translation, Showing Our Colors, Afro-German Women Speak Out. She has been visiting professor at several African and German universities. Upon retiring from Cornell in 2006, she was for 5 years director of the W.E.B. Du Bois Center for Pan-African Culture in Accra, Ghana. She is currently working on a book project on the reception of Toni Morrison in French and German-speaking Europe. So since COVID lockdown, she has a monthly Zoom gathering that she is with other people, with 15 people or so, right?
15 Fisk alumni.
Fisk,
Yeah.
Fisk
15
women.
people from my class at
Classmate.
Yeah.
That's quite amazing. From nearly 60 years ago, and she has taken on a life of its own, that gathering, beyond COVID, as a social network, and I'm sure something else will come out of it, always. Okay, now, I have to stop here. I could say more about Professor Adams, because I have seen her in different contexts in Africa and all that, but let me move to Professor Carol Boyce Davis, who is the H.T. Rhodes Professor of Humane Letters and Professor of Africana Studies and Literatures in English at Cornell, right here. She is the author of the prize-winning Left of Karl Marx, The Political Life of Black Communist Claudia Jones in 2008. The classic Black Women, Writing and Identity, Migration of the Subject, 1994. Caribbean Spaces, Escape Routes from Twilight Zone in 2017. 2017. And a bilingual children's story, Walking on Anaba, in a Creole, yeah. In 2016-17, in Haitian Creole, Haitian Creole and English. In addition to over 100 essays, articles, and book chapters, Dr. Boyce Davis has also published 13 critical editions on Africa, African diaspora, Caribbean literature and culture, including the 3-volume Encyclopedia of African Diaspora at Oxford, 2008. And Claudia Jones' Beyond Containment, autobiographical reflection, poetry, essay. A member of the Scientific Committee of UNESCO's updated General History of Africa. She edited the Epistemological Forum on Global Blackness for the African Diaspora volume. Her forthcoming contracted monograph is titled Black Women's Right and the Circularities of Power, next year, so stay tuned. She is a past president of the Caribbean Studies Association, which organized under her leadership the first association's conference in Haiti. Yeah, I was there. Okay, let's move to last but not least, as they say conventionally, Professor Richardson. Professor Richardson is a professor of African American literature at Cornell University in this Africana Studies and Research Center. Well, I'm going to say all those. Where she was born, significant. She was born and raised in Montgomery, Alabama. She attended Spelman College and earned a BA in English and minors in philosophy and women's studies. She earned her PhD from the English department at Duke University in 1998, along with a certificate in African and Africana studies, I suppose. African and African studies. Well, in 2001, she received a Ford Foundation postdoctoral fellowship. Her interviews have been highlighted in news media such as NBC's The Today Show and Nightly News, CNN, Al Jazeera, NewsHour, and the New York Times. Her op-eds have appeared in the New York Times, Public Books, and HuffPost. She has published nearly 40 essays in journals and edited collections. Her first book, Black Masculinity and the U.S. South, From Uncle Tom to Gangsta, was published by the University of Georgia Press in 2007 and was highlighted by Choice Books among the outstanding academic title of 2008. Her new book, Emancipation's Daughters, Reimagining Black Femininity and the National Body, was published in 2021 by Duke University Press. She is the editor of the New Southern Studies book series at the University of Georgia Press. She is also a visual artist whose art quilts have been featured in several solo and national exhibitions. I could say here also adding connection beyond some of my colonial past, as she spent time in France about some of her work. So, as I told you, we could spend the whole time talking about their lives, but the part of their lives we want to hear about is their connection to the HBCUs. So, brilliant scholars, sisters, the floor is yours. The moderator, you're going to tell them how to go, who will go first? 15 minutes?
Yes,
about
each speaker will speak for 15 minutes, and then when they are done, we throw it open, you know, of course, after you have listened to all my questions for them. So. If there's any time left. So let's start with Professor Adams.
Right, I'm the oldest, and and actually, I feel a bit of, I feel historical in the context of this panel and on HBCUs. Because I did graduate nearly 60 years ago from Fisk University. And yeah, I can say that I had teachers who were artists in the Harlem Renaissance. The art teacher, the primary art teacher when I was there was Aaron Douglas, a muralist. I had for freshman English, Robert Hayden, a poet. The university librarian was Arna Bonton, who was a poet and children's books writer. So, I come from, I had an elite education. And of course, Du Bois is our most famous alumnus. And Fisk enjoys a reputation as being one of the premier HBCUs. Fisk had the first chapter of Phi Beta Kappa at a black institution. Fisk's first black president was appointed in 1948. He was Charles S. Johnson, who is the father of the former Attorney General Jay Johnson. So, so educationally, socially, it was one of the most important experiences in my life. I came from Baltimore. I had wanted to go just down the road to Howard. My mother said, no, I want you gone. I need you to be away, not show up here every weekend with your dirty laundry and your hungry friends. So, also, I know she hoped that I would get a medical student husband at Meharry Medical College, the black medical college across the street. Yeah. Most mothers of daughters who went to Fisk thought that. A lot of them were, that was fulfilled, but anyway, but you know, that's what they, however, I got something better than a doctor husband. I got a wonderful education. And, you know, and I'm not going to only talk about famous people, but John Lewis was my classmate. You know, and I have to say in all honesty, at the time, I found him embarrassing. I mean, he died talking country, right? This brother had a country Georgia accent. And for us at Fisk, you know, who came from Baltimore and DC and Chicago, as well as a lot of small Alabama and Georgia towns, this country talking boy. But anyway, however, we did, you know, respect what he was doing. And many of us, of course, you know, participated as well. But anyway, so now I can brag and say that John Lewis, and I have to say that in the last 20 years or so, or no, since his political, since he became a congressman, I had so much respect for him, and I came to a different perspective about his speech. I mean, I'm a linguist, and so it matters to me, I'm afraid. And unfortunately, sometimes I judge people how they speak their mother tongue. But this man said so much in that country Georgia accent. He was so eloquent in that country Georgia accent. So I am pleased to be able to say that that going to Fisk enabled me over the decades that passed to appreciate. I wouldn't have appreciated John Henry Clark talking that way. John Henry Clark talked also like the small town North Carolina boy he was. Okay? And so I came to appreciate the brilliance, the eloquence, the gifts of my fellow sisters and brothers who were not from a big city like I was in Baltimore, or some of the people, as I said, from Chicago and Detroit and Cleveland and so forth. But it gave me an acquaintance with fellow blacks from the Deep South, and to appreciate everything that they are. And so this Zoom group that I put on the note here is it is a group of women from my class. We, as I said, we are almost 60 years out of graduation, who we actually came together long before. We came together the year that we all turned 70. We wanted to celebrate. That's 10 years ago. And I have to say that we came together because I was one of the initiators. We congregated in Ithaca. Now, summertime, Ithaca has lots of tourists, many tourists. We gathered in July, 10 years ago, well, it'll be 10 years next year. Let me tell you, of the tourist traffic that Ithaca, New York has, 15 black 70-year-old women on the Commons was not the kind of tourism that but anyway, but the fact that we are, 60 years out of college, and we are getting together on Zoom every month. We will be gathering in Houston next year and so forth to celebrate 80, and so that is no small product of my experience at Fisk University. Now, I also have to say that, as Indri said, I majored in German. We were 3 German majors, but because of the personal attention, it was through that I got the Fulbright, and also the fact that at this time in the early 60s, the Fulbright people were looking for black candidates. And so where is the best place to go to find them? You go to black schools. We knew that we were getting not special treatment, but they were targeting black students, and so so that advantage was there as well, and the preparation that I had in German put me in very good stead by the time I got to Berlin. So, okay, what else? There's some other. Oh, when I was saying that there were Harlem Renaissance artists who were among. I have to mention that Nella Larson, the author of the book Passing, which is now the film, studied at Fisk also in the early part of the 20th century. Fisk was as I said, it was an elite institution for those black students who could go. I also have to say that Fisk had all of the colorism that, especially during that time, Toni Morrison talks about colorism, that she found at Howard. The French professor, Monsieur Cotin, told me, he said, Mademoiselle Adams, 20 years ago, you would have been too dark to be accepted into Fisk. Now, Monsieur Cotin could be Femi's brother in terms of skin color, right? And he told me that I was too dark to have been accepted in. So there were a lot of the negative characteristics of black middle class, because most of us were black middle class, in order to be able to afford to go, because the school did not have much fellowship money, And so most of the students were supported by their families. Fisk today does not enjoy the position that its reputation has given it. Academically and in many other ways. Its enrollment is way down, and when we get into the discussion part, I would want to say some more things. But Fisk has not, for reasons that we alumni don't all understand, has not benefited in the way that Spelman has, in the way that Howard has as well. It does not have the kinds of donors and foundational support, although it has enjoyed this reputation as the premier of the HBCUs. And so when we are thinking about the role of HBCUs in the American academic landscape, I can say with great pride, historically, that Fisk University, was a major institution. But and I'll close with this fact. I looked at a listing of the top 10 HBCUs. This was 2 years ago, but a listing of the top 10 HBCUs, and Fisk University tied at the bottom. The last two were 9th place, and Fisk was one of those two tied at the bottom. Its enrollment is less than 1,000 now. When I was there, we were around 2,000. And so there are many factors which, as I said, I would want to talk about during the discussion, that some of us think are responsible for the demise of the university, because it can only be described in that way, as a demise. But I would not send my daughter to Fisk today. My daughter went to Spelman, but I would not send my daughter to Fisk today. And so that's a very sad note for me to end on, but that is the case. But as I said, I'll come back during the discussion with some other kinds of things I would want to say to that. Okay.
Thank you very much. So next we're going to have Professor Richardson, please.
Thank you so much, Professor Carlo.
Excuse me, I wanted to wear my sorority sweater too. I'm jealous.
I saw it when she came to faculty meeting.
George's graduation. Oh, yeah.
Good evening.
Good evening.
The title of my presentation is The Sweeter the Knowledge, which riffs on this t-shirt that was once very popular and in wide circulation in Black communities, that had a slogan that went, "The blacker the college, the sweeter the knowledge." So this is the sweeter the knowledge with a question mark. I grew up immersed in Black college life as someone living a block away from Alabama State University and the beats of its famous Marching Hornets band, beats that peaked annually during its homecoming parade and Turkey Day Classic game where ASU played Tuskegee. This is an intergenerational community event in Montgomery that nowadays, well, before the pandemic, draws alumni and visitors from around the nation and RV tailgaters and vendors from throughout the Southeast. Both schools were very familiar as ones attended by my mom and aunt, along with many relatives and family friends. My work in Beyonce studies and a recent essay has allowed me to discuss this homecoming phenomenon at HBCUs in relation to her 2019 homecoming concert. I actually kind of dressed for the occasion too by sporting Greek paraphernalia, and in my case, Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated, and actually all of our cases, And so this is my Delta jacket from my undergraduate years at Spelman, what might have been spotted at homecoming and all of the nomenclature, including African names. Like all of us had African names in my chapter at Spelman, Eta Kappa. And this shirt is a commemorative one to celebrate our 25th anniversary as a line. And so it was made for me and all of our line sisters in 2017. Actually, another one is coming up likely in the spring to celebrate our 30th anniversary. And so this is very commonplace among Black sororities and fraternities and other organizations as well that commission shirts to wear at the homecoming celebrations. We could talk more about all of those cultural practices. As a senior high school student who applied to college during the first year that U.S. News and World Report released this issue on America's best colleges, and who had received materials in the mail from various types of colleges and universities in the U.S., I aimed to attend what the latter described as a selective college, but applied to just 3 HBCUs, Hampton, Howard, and Spelman. My mom had ensured that we visited all of them. I was also offered a full tuition scholarship to Talladega and could have received support to attend Fisk as well had I chosen to apply because of my class rank and my high school's relationship to the institution. I had learned about Spelman primarily as the setting of one of my favorite television shows, A Different World, though I was not initially interested in or drawn to the idea of attending a women's college. Spike Lee had also helped to popularize Spelman and Morehouse for youth of my generation by representing their campuses in his 1987 film School Days, signal illustrations of HBCU representation in popular culture, along with films such as Stump the Yard and Drumline. I did not at all share the typical race and gendered rationales for attending an HBCU, such as a desire to learn more about Black history and culture, or for a women's college like Spelman to have the experience of a sisterhood. For as a teen girl at age 17, growing up in Montgomery, Alabama, I perceived myself to already have those things in my life in abundance. For I had attended all Black Catholic schools in Montgomery from first grade and was graduating from the historic St. Jude Educational Institute, the final camping place for Selma to Montgomery marchers in 1965, where we studied Black history in depth, and the celebration of Black History Month was institutionalized through weekly assemblies that I ultimately helped plan as student council vice president and then president there. Moreover, throughout my teen years, I had been involved with Zenos of the National Sorority of Phi Delta Kappa, whose historically Black teen girl organization was premised on principles of sisterhood and practiced them in its debutante cotillion program, in which I was a participant annually throughout my high school years until I was presented as one as a senior. Sisterhood was also a guiding principle within my federated club, Dora Beverly, and others with whom we worked throughout Montgomery, and also connected with at the annual state convention of the Alabama Association of Federated Youth Clubs, whose motto, like the Black Women's Club movement that mentored and sponsored us, was lifting as we climb. This was also true of my teen experience in the Zeta Arcanets. So in the end, the honest reasons that I was drawn to Spelman and chose to go there were that I decided that Hampton was too far away, too humid for my hair, and that I preferred a school that was not so far away from home, where my grandmother and family would be able to visit me, and scholarship money helped as well. I wanted to attend a school out of state, and liked the proximity of Spelman's location in Atlanta, its academic reputation, and the intimacy of its campus environment, which seemed to offer a solid educational experience. One of the strengths of Spelman was also its location in the largest consortium of HBCUs in the nation, which was made up of the over 5,000 students that also included Morehouse, Clark Atlanta University, Morris Brown, the Morehouse School of Medicine, and its interdenominational theological center. The AUC was a very diverse place intellectually, geographically, and culturally, located within a dynamic community that included institutions from Black churches to Black bookstores. Spelman, as one of the nation's 2 historically Black women's colleges, was, in its own way, truly a different world, and I'm thankful and blessed to have attended college there. I was supported by my core mentors and teachers in the English department in my major field, such as Christine Sizemore, Nancy Kearns, A.J. Billingslea, June Aldridge, Ann Warner, and Donna Akiba Sullivan Harper, as well as by my teachers and mentors in women's studies that included Gloria Wade Gills, Beverly Guy Sheftall, and Paula Giddings, not to mention the outstanding team of administrators led by Dean Freddie Hill and our beloved sister president and deacon, Dr. Janetta B. Cole. As a minor in the field, I received valuable instruction in philosophy from scholars such as Clarence Johnson, similarly valuable instruction in world civilization from Russell Andalcio, and was a member of Spelman's Philosophy Society, through which I met Cornell West and Mudimbe. My modern black male writers course with Stephen A. Carey and Morehouse is at the foundation of my eventual scholarly work on black masculinity, along with the geographical politics and hierarchies that I observed when I arrived at Spelman. I was committed to volunteering throughout my undergraduate years and worked weekly on Saturday mornings alongside Otis Moss and Monica, who's now his wife, tutoring in the Frederick Douglass Memorial Tutorial Program at Morehouse. I also volunteered at Spelman's Nursery School. I was invited to be a tutor in the Comprehensive Writing Program and kept that job for all 4 years as a result of my straight A's in freshman composition, and as a senior, took on a part-time job at Soul Source Bookstore, which was established by Wilbur Watson and honored the legacy of W.E.B. Du Bois in the Atlanta University Center, so close to where he had once lived. I think it was very special and made a difference to attend a school with mandatory weekly convocation programs for freshmen and sophomores on Tuesdays and Thursdays, whose height was the annual Founders Day celebration, to which we wore white dresses. Convocation exposed us to a range of guest speakers, including Billy Avery, Susan Taylor, and Josephine Dobbs Quimet. It was complemented by a living learning housing model also strongly invested in exposing us to literature by blacks in the U.S. and diaspora, beginning with our freshman reading list. Historically, Spelman was defined and limited by traditionalism, but by the time that I arrived in 1989, it was strongly invested in black women's empowerment and strongly impacted by black feminism, deeply committed to cultivating highly successful black women and other women of color. Because the truth is that Spelman was never a monolithically black place. And actually, there were multiple white exchange students who studied on campus as well, along with many men from Morehouse and students from throughout the AUC. Because many HBCUs are a repository for vast black cultural archives and emphasize black intellectual history, we gained exposure to such resources, and all AUC schools shared Woodruff Library, where a display of W.E.B. Du Bois's office and typewriter greeted us as we entered the library. They also did great programming, including a display I once saw there of early editions of texts in African American literary history that fascinated me as a student studying literature. Many of the most prominent and popular black intellectuals, including scholars, made trips to speak at schools in the AUC. I had the opportunity to hear, meet, and even interview a host of famous figures throughout my college years for the Spelman Spotlight newspaper as a reporter and eventually associate editor, such as the famed psychologist Kenneth B. Clark and the filmmaker John Singleton. During my undergraduate years, I heard many people speak and met a host of public figures. Student organizations were constantly planning panels. No major cultural event happened without there being a panel discussion planned by a student organization that provided interpretive context for reflection on the issue. We attended events and saw major speakers not only at Spelman, but also at the other AUC schools as well. Attending lectures with my friends was a part of the rhythm of social life as a student in the AUC. Over the years, I had the opportunity to hear major speakers throughout my college years, including Mari Evans, Angela Davis, twice, Pearl Cleage, Tina McElroy-Ansa, Toni Morrison, Alice Walker, Nikki Giovanni, Anita Hill, Bell Hooks, Hazel Carvey, Frances Cress Welsing, Julia Hare, Tony Brown, Hakeem Matabuti, Naeem Akbar, Cornell West, Mudimbe, and leaders from Stokely Carmichael, later Kwame Ture, to Minister Louis Farrakhan. Any Friday, amidst the African drummers and vendors who set up on the plaza for the crowd of students who gathered to mix and mingle on campus, Mukasa, known as Willie Ricks, who coined the slogan Black Power, might also be lecturing nearby. One day, I was just walking to class, and other students in proximity and I were stopped and invited to take a picture with the actor Harry Belafonte, and so stopped and posed for it, and then went on. We were exposed to a diverse and dynamic ideological climate in which free speech was encouraged, which honed acute critical thinking abilities and catalyzed rigorous debate. Seeing and meeting prominent and interesting scholars was part of what inspired me to become one. Socially, DC house music was predominantly played at social events on campus when I arrived, and step shows for freshmen at Spelman and Morehouse were highlights. It was at the freshman step show my sophomore year where many of us first saw the duo perform that became popularly known as Criss Cross. It was also beneficial to be in a place like the AUC because recruiters from major businesses and institutions in the nation, including some of the nation's top investment banks, as well as universities, sent representatives to local career fairs to recruit from the pool of 5,000 plus Black students, and also maintained close connections with our schools, viewing them as valuable pipelines for finding potential job candidates. Elsewhere, I discussed Spelman's vibrant and colorful artistic environment and artist showcase there, like Barnett Honeywood, along with how projects such as Beverly Guy Chaptal's co-edited volume Double Stitch influenced me to begin quilting by my senior year, how connections in the AUC shaped my commitment to student activism as an undergraduate, how my women's studies courses with Dr. Gale, such as Images of Women in the Media, ultimately led to my co-founding an organization called Sisters in Solidarity to Eradicate Sexism, and how her course on Black women's autobiography helped inspire my work documenting my family history and family themes at the core of my art quilt project. As a student at Spelman, I made multiple friends whom I continue to treasure, also valued being a part of Spelman's Christian Fellowship, and was initiated into the Eta Kappa chapter of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated in 1992 as a junior. Like so much at Spelman, Delta, along with AKA, was larger than life. Our chapter on campus consistently produced high-quality and educational programming, and its periodic parties at the luxury hotels in downtown Atlanta were popular and drew many people with crowds outside that couldn't be accommodated, crowds only conceivable really in Black college environments. I first met Reverend Raphael Warnock as an undergraduate at Morehouse when he was at Morehouse as well. Indeed, it is noteworthy that many of the nation's activists who have stood at the vanguard of Black activist movements, including the contemporary moment, have roots at HBCUs, including Spelman and Morehouse. Figures such as Reverend Otis Moss, Eddie Glaude, Jamal Bryant, Hassan Jeffries, Shaun King, Stacey Abrams, Spike Lee, and so many others. Spelman has been at the foundation of the social life and networks that I have built as an adult, which has expanded all the more in the context of social media, which has allowed me to meet and get to know far more women and men from Spelman and Morehouse and other HBCUs now and from other places beyond than I ever met back then, or even at homecomings that I have attended since. And HBCU education has been at the foundation of all the major choices in my life, from dedicating my life to Christian faith, to serving as a pipeline into graduate school for me at Duke, mirrors and reinforces the core values of my family and community at home, and will also most likely influence my life choices like marriage and the man I end up with. A Spelman education is one of the best things that's ever happened to me. It's been such a blessing in my life and truly a gift in life that has kept on giving, as I've also worked my hardest and tried my best to also give back as well.
Thank you very much. We're doing well with time, so there's no, so I really appreciate that. So finally, we have Professor Carlo Boyce Davis. The floor is yours.
Okay, cool. I have class at 6:30. I was whispering, so I may not be able to stay too long. So I just want to say that for Caribbeans of my generation, a choice between Harvard and Howard would be Howard. And there was no confusion. And I'm thinking it's probably because when I look back, because the next generations, I think, probably want to go to Harvard. But I think when I look back, it could be because Eric Williams, who was the prime minister of my generation, had taught at Howard, and Howard was in the area. That was where people wanted to go, where people went, graduated, came back over. So at Howard, where I did my master's, and actually these notes I had, I was with, actually Femi was there at just before the pandemic closure at Harvard for their 50th anniversary, and they had sent a number of questions they wanted me to respond to, and I wrote them, but we didn't get to use them, so now I'm using them. So anyway, so I'm talking here, I deliberately wanted to say this at Harvard, the HBCU Ivy League Africana connection is really important, right? So at Howard, where I did my master's in African Studies under the directorship of P. Chike Onwuachi, one of his favorite topics in the Theory and Methods class was Leo Hansberry. Leo Hansberry, 1894 to 1965, who he would repeatedly say African Studies at Howard should be named after. A former Cornell colleague, Ayele Bekere, has an essay which indicates that it titled Africana and African Past, that Hansberry may have been the one who coined the term Africana Studies. This is really important to say this here. And there's a Harvard connection for Hansberry. Upon his graduation from Harvard, Hansberry taught for a year at Straight College, now Dillard University in New Orleans. In September 1922, Hansberry joined the faculty of Howard University, where he started the African Civilization section of the history department. Hansberry received his master's from Harvard in 1932, and why? Because there was nobody qualified to give him a PhD there. This is an amazing thing to know. So along with that, he did a postgraduate work at the University of Chicago, Oxford University, and Cairo University in Egypt. His knowledge of African studies was so vast that he was unable to obtain his PhD because there was no school with faculty members qualified to supervise his dissertation. In fact, there was a speaker last week in the classics department named Solange Ashby, and they formed, she said, a Leo Hansberry Society or something like that, with a petition for Harvard to give him retroactively his PhD degree. So as a professor at Howard, Hansberry taught courses on African civilizations and cultures. By the mid-1930s, he was internationally recognized by his peers as an outstanding scholar in his field. And as our chair just said, among his students were two future African leaders, Kwame Nkrumah, who would later become the first Prime Minister of Ghana and President of Ghana, and then the other was Nnamdi Azikiwe, who studied anthropology under him from 1928 to 1929. Azikiwe would become the first president of Nigeria, and he wrote the eulogy for him. In 1961, then Governor General Azikiwe thought Hansberry's work so important that he offered to underwrite the publication of his major work, The Rise and Decline of the Ethiopian Empire. Hansberry was, of course, something else. He was the uncle of the more well-known, famous Lorraine Hansberry, playwright and dear friend of Cordia Jones, and perhaps the only woman that Harold Cruz singled out for attack in his famous book, The Crisis of the Negro Intellectual. So this suggesting an amazingly small circle of black activists, it seems, operated in that period with that kind of global, international impact. So when I got to Howard, I first did my undergrad at the University of Maryland Eastern Shore largely because my brother worked there on the faculty, and that was where my mother said I had to go and kind of, that's where you go, like animals say. But I was dreaming of going to Howard. I was an English major there, but I was planning to go to law school. And actually, I always still remember my prof when he asked me about grad school, and I said, I would never go to grad school in English. Why would I do that? I'm going to law school. His face just fell. He just looked at me like, and then look at how I ended up. Right? I know. So I always saw his face, and he was so crestfallen when I said that because I was tied for first place in my undergrad class. So I could have gone anywhere. So I applied to Columbia and American U. There was two schools only, and I got into both to do international law. I go to American U because it's DC, and I want to be in DC. It's trying to get away from family too in Brooklyn and New York, and then go to DC. But I'm at American U, Afro puffs, hot pants, platform shoes, and my classmates were staid, business-looking type intellectuals. I was the only black person. They looked at me like, what the hell is that? So I started hanging out more with Howard students, and by the next semester, I went to Howard. So I made it back to Howard. So anyway, but I did a couple courses in international law and I went back and corrected some of that later on. I can talk about that later. Anyway, one of the things that happened in a place like Howard was that one was exposed, and I think you see that as a trend, almost routinely to a panoply of black intellectual figures, either as teachers, lecturers, visitors, or other members of the campus community. You can see Muhammad Ali walking down the street, often without knowing their value outside of the context. Stokely Carmichael was always on campus, talking and so on. So all of those names identified that are pretty well-known writers in the black US canon came through Howard. One could see on a day-to-day basis Taylor James and his tall, lean presence and Stetson hat and open trench coat as a normal feature of campus life. On Howard's campus, I routinely saw people like Stephen Henderson, author of The Understanding New Black Poetry. Leon Damas of Negritude fame was my thesis advisor. He was also the director of African Studies at Howard when I was there. Sterling Brown, Haki Madhubuti, John O'Killens, all of them were on campus. A physically diminutive but powerfully present Dorothy Porter ran the Moreland Spingarn Research Library. Poet Ethelbert Miller worked upstairs in the African American Studies Library, in the same Founders Library where I worked as a library assistant, and he was then fast becoming the poet that he is today. On the steps of Founders Library at Howard, all the Caribbean men, students would gather and debate politics loudly and cuss, and they would tell their move and stuff. But in front of Howard, that was the Howard Caribbean Students Group. So one day I sat in, and I've told this to my students in other classes, I sat in on a Sailor James class, Pan-Africanism class, routinely because I was dating a guy named Ken Ford who was in the class, and he would always tell me, come and sit in the class. I was a lit major, so I didn't have to do it. So I would go to Sailor James's class, and then one day he said, guess what, there's going to be a speaker, you should come and hear that. That person was Sylvia Winter. And she was the first sophisticated black woman scholar I ever met, speaking in James' class at his invitation. And I say this because the students who went to UE would have gotten a range of women like that. But I did not, up until then, meet a Caribbean woman with that kind of strength and power and intellectual might. Through her, then, I realized the possibility of becoming a Caribbean woman scholar. From Leon Damas, though, I heard stories of his encounters with Langston Hughes and life in Paris. I remember seeing once what I thought was a white man who seemed so overly comfortable with the campus. And I asked the librarian, who was that man? Who is that man? She said, why, that's Sterling Brown. My African American literature courses were taught by Arthur P. Davis, editor of Cavalcade, and he would just talk casually about everybody. So this one and that one. So it was like almost you were meeting them through his eyes. And he was then the preeminent source of African American literature before the field became the staple it is in the academy. Arthur P. knew everything there was to know about every writer in the canon at the time, and taught his course in a conversational tone, expressing direct and personal knowledge of all the writers in their works. So my black intellectual self is shaped by those early moments of black self-articulation, but also subsequently the work of black women's studies and black feminisms, and beyond that, the black left activism of a number of activist intellectuals who created the black radical intellectual tradition, which has as its task the challenge of male privilege and white privilege, at least to call it out when we see it operating flagrantly. For me, it came with an understanding of how these various privileges are layered, how male supremacy and white supremacy are layered. Okay. For me, it came with that understanding. Operating always then with a claim to innocence, just as how white people say, for example, oh, I didn't realize I was being racist. Men say the same thing all the time. And they operate then with an entrenched and sedimented set of operations of masculinity and whiteness that come together then. So what relevant connections then do I see? Africana studies, African and African American studies were created in the same time frame then as many of the decolonization movements. I think the work on decoloniality still has a place then in terms of decolonizing the academy, as we argued in having the English department change to literatures in English, not just in the US but around the world, and students from universities all over the world have been participating in that process. So for me then, the logic that we got from people like Stokely and others repeatedly was the logic of study and struggle, that those two things go together. So therefore, scholarship and activism then, for me, are never separated. They're part of the same thing. So I'm always reminded then in closing by Walter Rodney's assertion in the Groundlings with My Brothers that, quote, Black people are here in these institutions because keep in mind that the demise of Fisk and the others happened primarily because the scholars, the students came to Cornell, went to Harvard, and decided that they needed a different level of intellectual engagement. So their loss then is the gain of these institutions. The same thing happens, I think, BG and others would argue, with African scholars coming to work in the United States to the demise of their home universities, whether it's Ibadan, where I got my PhD, and so on. So I'm reminded of Walter Rodney's assertion that, quote, Black people are here in these institutions as part of the development of Black struggle, but only as a concession designed to incorporate us within their structure. He was referring then to the theoretical assumptions and the entire ideological underpinnings of what we have to learn in every discipline. So for me then, being in the presence of intellectual communities is part of an ongoing engagement, part of struggle, part of learning as well from people who surround, but also never really seeing a disconnection between those two imperatives of study and struggle.
So now, from the time we scheduled originally, we'll have about 15 minutes of conversation. I hope we can go slightly over that because we started quite a bit late. Floor is open. Questions, comments, observations, complaints, if any? Yes, Eric.
I want to thank you three for your excellent presentations, and wow, you know, and a lot of what you said reminded me of Africana when I came here in '87 as a grad student. The Black intellectuals that you exposed to, you know, and then you hear the history of Africana in terms of those that taught here, like the Walter Rodneys and these other folks, and for you to be on that is like, it's just amazing. At the time when you were exposed to these faculty, did you realize how big there was? Because Leo Hansberg, you can't get bigger than that at Howard. I mean, I know you didn't study with him, but still, I mean, it's huge. Did you realize what you were exposed to at the time or not? In terms of some of these faculty?
I'm gonna say no. Arnaud Bontemps, who I later learned collaborated with Langston Hughes and so forth, was the university librarian. I would see him walking around campus, and he was the librarian. And I have to say also, my freshman writing teacher was Robert Hayden, a poet.
Wow.
I hated him. I hated him. So,
The Great Debaters, the film The Great Debaters is about him, right? I believe so, a debate team that went to. Yeah, it's about
And Douglas, who was the art instructor, we could take art appreciation or music appreciation, and I chose music appreciation. But his murals were around the institution. And I want to say just, historically, I entered college in 1959. As I said, John Lewis was in my class. This was just on the cusp of the movement. The sit-ins were happening in Nashville, and Fisk, like I dare say all of the other HBCUs at that time. First of all, they had an entirely white curriculum for the most part. I think we probably read a couple of Black writers, but it was not a the curriculum was definitely not heavily infused with anything about Black people there in the early 60s. And I have to say also that when the sit-ins and other activism started, most of the faculty were critical of it. They said, to the students, if you go and get yourself put in jail, you are still required to get your assignments in. Absolutely, absolutely. Parents said, boy, I sent you to get an education. I bet not hear your asses in jail. So this was just as it was starting, and so there were many, adults who were and some students. I did not sit in. I did homework assignments and handed them in the name of students who were in jail. So as I said, we are different generations historically here, and so even though yes, I had instructors who were Harlem Renaissance people, I had peers who were sit-in demonstrators and teachers who were. I mean, this is in Nashville. You are not to upset the racial thing. We could not try on things, and so we were told to get dressed when you go downtown. There's all this stuff from the Jim Crow South, and so it is. It was an evolution, for it to move to the situation it was at Howard was bigger and had a bigger and more diverse population than Fisk did anyway. But by the time Richer comes along, then all of that has gone before is can benefit that generation again.
And I agree with that. Like I was from a generation, I think, that was generally well aware of who was in our midst, and we were very committed to listening to and learning from a range of prominent Black scholars and public figures. And so the late 1980s into the early 90s was a prime time for those kinds of conversations on campuses and beyond. And so it was just really a wonderful moment.
We knew, and in fact I was telling somebody, Walter Rodney came and was speaking again to the Caribbean students and some of the grad students in African studies, and the students were questioning him on the fine points of Marxism. They're like, so I was like, wow, this is amazing. So in other words, they didn't back down because he was Walter Rodney. They were like, no, you got that wrong. You're missing this aspect of dialectical materialism. Something like that.
That's awesome.
But then, people were like, as I mentioned, Leo Damas, he would invite us home to his house for dinner almost every Friday.
Wow.
If you wanted to go, so that people you knew would be like, can you help me get an invite over there? And he would talk about, all his engagements with people he knew, and so on, and so on. So these things became sort of almost part of your conversational knowledge, your framework, but also the assumption for every single student, and I still carry that you are going to do well. No student is left behind. The assumption that our Black students should get through and do well. They should be supported. They should not be oppressed. They should not be treated badly. You should find the best in them and bring it out. So we actually bring that sort of HBCU logic. Some of us, I know I do, and I'm sure my colleagues here do, when we engage our students. That's what you're getting when you work with me. That's how I engage you. I engage you with that love that you need to finish. You are special. You are a young Black man whose parents sent you here, or a young Black woman, and you need to be treated with dignity and with love. And we should make sure that you get everything that you need to graduate. And this is the philosophy. It's not just me. It's coming from that place that I got, and people treated me like that. And therefore I extend it to you, and hopefully you all will also carry that forward.
Yes, just before you, anyone else, it's not clear in my head, but Azikiwe went back to Nigeria and founded a university in eastern Nigeria called University of Nigeria at Nsukka.
Okay.
And if I am not mistaken, I will need to check this, either the library there is named after Leo Hansberry
It would probably be.
at this university, because I have a lecture a monograph in my office on Africana art and soca.
Oh, you're kidding me.
So I'll be glad to share it with people.
Oh, wow.
It's
See,
already
there you
PDF,
go.
you know. So,
Yeah.
so when you were mentioning that, so that
Yeah.
came to me. So I'm
I
trying to
believe he
see-
went there, he visited him.
Exactly, because you know
Yeah.
that Zik, you know, established, you know, that university for the state,
Ah,
and that's the reason he also called the University of Nigeria. So it's only the only university that did not have a regional name.
right.
So you know, because of this, you know.
Yeah, he had a lot of respect for Hansberg, so I would
Right.
imagine
So,
that.
but I will check that and then if I will share it with people. So please.
Nice.
Yes.
Nice.
Yeah. So I guess I have two questions. So thank you very much for this really, really awesome talk. The first question is like I was wondering if you guys can speak a little bit more about the transition from these historically Black universities to kind of like places like these. In the sense that like you know on the one hand your experience that you guys described is you know there's a very strong history of like solidarity and support and activism and inspiration, but there's also kind of common things that we still experience in the sense of sexism, colorism, right, that weren't completely absent from these institutions as well. And so how was the transition like from these places to here? You know, what kind of aspects of that were the same and were different for you guys? And I guess the second question is, you know, I'd like to hear a little bit more about kind of like the demise of universities like this, the factors that led to that, and kind of what role institutions, you know, like centers like Africana Studies play in that, right? In the sense of like diverting resources, human resources and financial resources from these institutions. I remember when I was applying for a PhD, I thought very much about Howard. And then I looked at kind of what they were offering in terms of compensation packages and I was like, you know, this is a no-brainer in many ways. But like, you know, how are we kind of implicated as well in kind of like the demise of these institutions and what role can we play to elevate them or, you know, to make sure that they still maintain kind of a strong presence and maintain that history that kind of brought us on.
We had an interesting discussion because Dr. Lumumba will probably can add to it. But one of the foundational courses that was created here on Black intellectual traditions was meant to bring in HBCU as well.
Mm-hmm.
But it was funded by Ford Foundation for 3 or 4 years or 5 years. And it had a regional consortium sort of effect. But it also had HBCUs as well. So to me, there has to be a deliberate attempt to do that because people who work in HBCUs teach a lot. They teach a lot of courses more than we do in a research university context. So any of you, if you go to work in an HBCU, just keep in mind you're going to be teaching like 4 courses. And that means you're not going to have a lot of time for research. People still work and produce work, as you know, Spelman and other spaces have a strong emphasis on that. But the teaching part of it is probably the heavier part of the professorial experience. So, and it takes away from that. For example, there's a historian named Lydia Lindsay who was working on Claudia Jones when I met her. She teaches at North Carolina Central University. But she's never been able to finish. She's a historian. My book was written with the assumption that hers was going to be published in close proximity. So there's some things I didn't even bother to go into because I was like, she's going to catch that. But her work has never come out. But it's because of that, that sort of heavy demand of teaching and historians, as you know, have to track down every single archive because they can't finish their work. So that's part of it. So she probably can't fit in all of that. But I always feel for that you know, because I have a different opportunity to have the space to do research in a Research One university, then you can, and great librarians like Erica Creed to make sure you find all your work, then it has an impact on the intellectual production. So I think that's one of the biggest pieces that would make people make the choice to be in a Research One in an Ivy League because you have a support structure that is way, like you said, in terms of getting funding, that is way better.
And I would say another reason that historian couldn't go and track down is because her institution has less money to support her research travels. And that is critical, right? I mean, if she knows where the materials are and so forth and needs, you know, $3,000 to go during the summer and do it, her university may not be able to give her but $500 or something if they want to do it, and so that is a major thing. And so the thing that I want to put in here is this the financial, the economic situation, which is so important in the qualitative differences in these institutions. This example that Carol gave, you're teaching 4 courses, and plus you can't get your research done because of resources. And so I was thinking about an analogy with families. We know in this country that one of the economic situations that keeps Black families from moving ahead is the inability to accumulate wealth over generations, right? So we have Black students at Cornell who will graduate and be paying loans for eons, whereas many of their white counterparts, Michelle and Barack Obama finished paying off their student loans 5 minutes before they got into the White House. I mean, within 10 years of not closer than 10 years before they got in the White House. Okay? So, his predecessor, which was George W. Bush.
Yeah.
Okay? So, the institutions are similar. We know that a lot of what contributes to the quality of education at Cornell University comes from contributions from alumni. Alumni contribute $5 million, and then the university can attract from other donors the additional $5 million for this laboratory. Okay, the only one of its kind in the Northeast, for example. Okay, so and another example that I just read, Toni Morrison, after she died, and she left 2 residences, an apartment in Manhattan and a house on the Hudson. Her son is living in the house on the Hudson. He sold the apartment in Manhattan for $3.75 million to a Cornell alumnus, by coincidence, who's been out of school only 15 years. Now, who in here, 15 years after graduation, is going to be able to buy anything for $3.75? Okay. So, that alumnus probably had most of that money when he was an undergraduate here. Okay, these schools are the same. They write to us as alumni saying contribute and so forth and so on. We as alumni are not in the financial position to contribute in the same way so we have not accumulated wealth. Our institutions cannot accumulate wealth if they're depending to such a large degree on alumni. And so Spelman has probably the biggest endowments of all of them, Spelman and Hampton. Howard is a U.S. government-funded institution, so it is guaranteed a certain level of funding, and the government can solicit funds from other places. But a place like Fisk doesn't have the donors like Spelman, and Hampton is probably next after Spelman in having such contributions. So, what is an HBCU to do when it cannot get big infusions of money? Like I said, for Cornell, alumni giving attracts giving from other places. That's the point, because Fisk is telling us we want you to give at a certain rate so that we can attract other monies. And so I don't know what the answer to that is. I really don't know. The costs are going up. If the university wants to offer good quality, then that costs more, the technology and so forth and so on. And it doesn't have many funds for scholarships. I learned at one point that Fisk was attracting more students, but it was, and giving them scholarships, ostensibly, but those scholarships were really, it was just waiving their tuition fees. It was not money that the university was getting to support those students. It was just that the university was letting them come for free. You know, so that is for me. And when I said I would not send my child to Fisk today, it's for those reasons. It doesn't have the resources to give the kind of education that that they would need. That's the. So, and in fact, I'll just say this one last thing. One close friend of mine, this guy, who was a lawyer and worked actually as a bank lawyer for much of her career, and lives in Nashville, where Fisk is. She thinks that Fisk and some others that are in the same financial situation should merge with a better off white institution locally, and just be, there is, for example, a college or university near Nashville called Sewanee University. And so she said, for example, it could be Fisk-Sewanee, and they would, you know, they would share and so forth, but it would be a way of propping up Fisk. And the very last thing I'll say is to show you just how dire the situation is. Fisk inherited a number of paintings from the artist, what's her name? She painted big flowers. George O'Keeffe. I don't know why O'Keeffe willed those paintings, but several, maybe a half a dozen paintings that are worth about them. Fisk was at the point one time of selling off one or more of those paintings. The rationale being, first of all, we don't have the infrastructure to preserve and to exhibit the paintings. We got them, but they're in a storeroom. What has happened, though, fortunately, to an alumni would say, "Oh, you can't sell those paintings," but the president's saying, "But we don't have," because at that time, they were financially so bad off that they didn't pay the heat bill in Jubilee Hall, the freshman dorm. Those students were standing out on the street with signs, "Please pay for Fisk's heat bill so we can," they have, which is of course an embarrassment. But the point, what happened with those paintings is that the Walton Company, the Walmart people in Arkansas, entered into an agreement with Fisk whereby they will essentially be custodians of those paintings. Fisk still owns them nominally. They are physically now in Arkansas, and I think being displayed being exhibited by the Waltons. But in any case, it was a way of saving that. So that's the situation.
And I'll just,
Okay.
I have something to say as well. I will speak to the first part of your question. I think that coming from an HBCU and going into graduate school at a predominantly white institution, one of the most jarring things was feeling a strong sense of alienation after coming from a place where the Black community and systems of support had been so dynamic. And so that was something that I felt very viscerally going into my graduate program. I also felt a strong sense of responsibility. I was literally the first person, Black person, and coming from a historically Black college. So there were Black students who had come before me, but I was the first to be admitted into my program from a historically Black college, and so there was a sense of responsibility in that. And then I noticed the undergraduate student population at Duke and how much the tendency was to direct conversations at the white student population. And so that was very different from what I had experienced in the Atlanta University Center, where we were very self-reflective as Black people and very self-critical, like in an internal way, as Black people, and working through various issues and differences constantly. And I didn't see as much space for that when I began to observe the undergraduates at Duke, whom I really admired for a range of reasons. They were very brilliant, always, but that was one of the stark differences that I witnessed. So much was pitched at, and I think that had to do with just the climate that some experienced and a sense of persevering and doing well in it. And then the other thing was that there was a kind of conundrum that I began to notice, where at Spelman we could really take for granted that our Black faculty, as well as the white mentors, were very engaged and concerned in with mentoring and supporting us. But I never really thought about what it would be like to deal with, say, Black faculty members who are not necessarily very invested in Black students. And so a lot of the presumptions that I arrived with, that there was, how do I put this? That things one would just take for granted in the intellectual culture at Spelman were challenged, as in my graduate experience at Duke, I would say, because there wasn't always that sense of a strong commitment among Black faculty in mentoring and supporting Black students and other students of color.
Yes, please.
Thank you so much. I love hearing you guys speak about your connection, especially to the intellectual, Black intellectuals, so interesting to hear. Talk a little bit about the economic aspect of that experience. I'm curious to hear about your guys' thoughts on the social aspect, being faculty at a predominantly white institution. I know two of you guys, I know, are listed as also being part of the Department of Literatures and English, which is predominantly white. So I'm curious to hear about how that experience kind of informs the way you guys approach teaching in general. And I think of someone like Nicole Hannah-Jones, who ends up going to a Howard and going from a PWI to a Black institution. Here's you guys' thoughts on those. Are you guys going to quit Cornell and go to?
In fact, I told somebody, I'm at the point in my career where, I didn't feel like going to start anywhere else. Mm-hmm. But if the only other place I would go would be Howard, I told that to Howard friend. They're like, "Oh my God, are you serious?" Get you there. Just for all kinds of historic reasons, just for giving back and all that stuff. Yeah, that's the only place I would go. But I've always, in my entire career, been in an Africana Studies department with a joint appointment in Literatures and English or English. But my residence has always been in the Africana because that's where I got trained. That's my field. So I may be the only person in this department with a master's in African Studies. I'm almost certain of that. So my formation is already, that's my field. So I can't abandon it for any other place because of that. So I work in Literatures and English because my other field is literature. Therefore, that's where those students are. That's where I work. So for me, it's like visitor theory, like I did with the Hurston. It's like I go visit and I come back. So when I go to those departments. And I remember when I was at Binghamton, just hired, I had two offices. I had one in English and one in Africana Studies. And they said, "Which one do you want?" And I said, "Africana." And the English department were really upset, like, "Really? How could you do that?" And then I talked to the chair of Africana, Audrey Smedley, who is somebody really major, taught me everything about how these departments run. And she said, "They can't tell you where you can be wherever you want to be." So basically, that's my residential home is always in Africana Studies. And I engaged the lit people to the extent that I have to engage them. That's the best way I can explain it. But Africana is not without its own challenges. You still have to deal with male domination, male supremacy, sexism, and all of that. So you have, like for black women, you get both. It's like you're trying to navigate all of these. On the one hand, you know, you're dealing with the men in your department who you have to make sure they know that you're there, visible. And then in the other department, you know, they're benign and kind, but you know, they don't really care if you come around. That's it.
I would say that for me, anyone who even imagines
Excuse me, I have a class, so I need to go to my class.
Well, we should give her the applause before.
Oh.
Here. Yeah.
Here it goes.
Oh, and I think I dropped my pen over there.
For me, anyone who has ever imagined in any of these institutions that they could undermine my self-esteem or my belief in my own abilities never met my grandmother, who every day that I left my apartment in Sacramento gave me the send-off, hold up your head and strut. So I was always very aware, keenly aware of my own value and worth, as well as my abilities. And that did a lot, I think, to strengthen me. My faith strengthened me on that journey, and always it was a walk by faith, I think, from the beginning of my career. We were talking earlier about what it meant that you were born literally the very year that I defended my dissertation, and that my students that I have now were literally in strollers back then, and now grown up, you know, in the course of my career. So time, you know, I think about that. But there are climates that we encounter in some cases as Black people and people of color that can be unconsciously hostile and sometimes very deliberately so. I would say that the norm has not been for me to experience like any racial microaggressions. I remember what it was like on my former job in some cases to go into faculty meeting and like, you know, a couple of white women would be sitting there talking to each other, wouldn't acknowledge me coming into the room and that sort of thing. And, you know, I just never really internalized that or took it seriously. I think it's different too depending on the backgrounds that some people have. You know, at the beginning of my presentation, I talked about my experiences growing up in all Black Catholic schools. And so, you know, I came from the kinds of educational context where I was elected to office. I've heard an auditorium of people saying "Riche, Riche" all the way and championing me as I ran for offices. And so when I first entered a predominantly white institution, I was a woman and 22 years old. I think, you know, going with a wealth of experiences, I talk about it in terms of what it means to go to the front line. And I think there's a very different experience when one, say, goes to that front line at age 5, and then when you go as someone maybe who has more life experience and more of a perspective on yourself. And so what astonishes me, Billy, and what pains me is that there are people out there every bit as talented as I am, even more in many cases, but who have never in their lives had any of that validated or affirmed. And I think that that's where the real need is located, that we need to really understand that some people can get hurt and have their sense of selves like seriously questioned in institutional context. And so that's kind of I'm always, you know, trying to even reach people who have had that kind of experience to affirm them, you know, because ultimately all of us I think, have distinct gifts that can fly under the radar in institutions that have a tendency to devalue us.
So, you have the last question. So.
Oh, okay, that's nice. Oh, hello. Thank you for speaking. I'm Mariah, first year PhD student here at Africana. And so I started thinking about the possibilities of technology now, given with COVID, how a lot of our classes ended up being online and how that can be now a new space of reimagining how we orient ourselves in the institution. So, for example, you talked about Fisk, and students were there and they didn't have heat in their dorms. What is it if we say, okay, maybe your first 2 years can be online and virtual, and then the next 2 years are in person, right? How that can save money, but also doesn't take away from students actually getting disengagement, or also being able to see visiting scholars from the continent, from the Caribbean, coming to engage with the classroom, or even students, let's say in Africana at Cornell, helping teach at Fisk, for example, because you can do that online. You don't have to physically leave. Yeah, I just wanted to know what are y'all thoughts on, the possibilities of virtual learning and how that can help, help resolve some of these issues or help mediate in a way. I don't know if you.
Well, I suppose that is something that that could be taken into consideration. However, my sense of being at a black school, the physical being there, the being in the dormitory, the being in the organizations, the being at the homecoming, and so on, that for the social part, and not just the black schools. I mean, part of the when all schools went on lockdown, spring of last year, there were many parents who were saying, I am paying money for my students to get the full college experience. And so, while on the one hand, the classes certainly could be done remotely, God, even eating that awful food in the cafeteria, I mean, at least you're eating it with other people. So much of what what being at an HBCU means is outside the classroom and cannot be replicated otherwise. But certainly, if compromises have to be made, then the idea of first year or something, or some year, 1 year or something, remote or something like that. Then on the other hand, colleges make money off of the room and board that students pay too. So that's one of the that was one of the impetuses for many schools in coming back in person fully, because these students, I mean, not only do the schools make money, but it's in Ithaca anyway, it's the whole economy, because Cornell is the largest employer in the county. The hundreds of people who are employed in the dormitories and in the cafeterias and stuff are unemployed when the students are away, not to mention the businesses downtown that depend on. So, I mean, it is a whole, there's a whole chain, and so the finding ways to mitigate the economic burden while still offering as much as possible the essence of what those institutions offer, that's a big challenge. But certainly that the technology, Probably. Well, I was, even making sure all the classrooms are properly outfitted for that. I mean, the technology costs money as well. So I don't want to make it seem like Fisk is in the poorhouse, but well, I'll just let it trail off. And it's not the only one. It's not the only one. Janetta Cole, after she left Spelman, went to the other black women's college, Bennett, and resurrected it.
Yes.
And she is that kind of administrator, but she can only do so much. But she certainly did, put it back on a good footing. Okay, so done.
And I'll only add, I like your ideas, they sound interesting, and I think it's important and valuable to think outside the box. I share Professor Adams' concerns and agree that these issues would have to be thought through very extensively. I think it's interesting that we now have a new vision of like digital education and what's possible in a post-Zoom, well, it's not really post-Zoom yet, take that back, but in a Zoom dominated, yeah, well, I don't know. But we've gained a lot, and there are some things that I don't want to give up because I like the effects, and so like to draw on the best of what we gained in this very difficult moment, and then to build upon all of the resources that have been available in the past, I think is really key. Another thing that makes me somewhat concerned is that we also have to think about certain ideological uses and abuses of technology, such as the promotion of homeschooling in a reactionary way by proponents who want to undermine the public education system. And so online education as promoted in those contexts becomes not so visionary, but something that literally can be weaponized against minority populations in some cases. Even though I do like a lot of principles of homeschooling and think that they should be more universally embraced and applied. So the challenges I think are definitely there, but the future is yours, as they say, and so I think it's going to be important to maybe share and experiment with all of these ideas that newer generations are coming up with.
Okay, you want to say anything before?
We just, as I mentioned earlier, this is a two-part series, and some of the points you have made, your own trajectories, and some of the structural issues that you have raised really position us well to think of the next, which will be around a book that just came out by Adam Harris on the HBCUs, the state must educate. Really fascinating. So our discussion will be around it. So I hope that you will be able to join us at that time. So I'm most grateful to our colleagues. I mentioned the other day Professor Edmondson, who was teaching here, retired. I invited him back to my class. It was a wonderful experience for him. And when I introduced him, I mentioned that I remember vividly, as the director of Africana Studies, he organized a series, Africana Studies, from this traditional disciplinary perspective, because Africana has not produced enough people of our own, the idea of Africana Studies, interdisciplinary. So many of us who teach here come from those so-called traditional disciplines. Still, how do you articulate, conceptualize, teach, research on Africana Studies from your perspective? And it was the most enriching experience for all of us. So this is something close to that. Maybe we will think of engaging our faculty in bringing us different trajectories. And this is one of them. There will be other models, other framework through which people journeyed to where we are today. So I thank you for joining us, and make sure you check and come back. And when you're coming back, one of the strategies in the movement, you don't come back alone, even no matter how passionate, you come back with others. This is how you build. So we want to re-engage Africana studies. We used to have a colloquium that was very vibrant. People looked forward to it. So we want to bring it back. And it can be useful only if you're here and you engage, you come with questions. So really, make sure you share this experience with others, and let's work together to make the spring engagement really building on this wonderful afternoon that we have spent together. So I want to thank Professor Taiwo, who, I don't know who told him to ask me to serve as chair of the programming committee, but no matter the difficulties of organizing in the COVID context, it has been most enriching. And this is one of the experiences that you go through so much, but then when you have the substantive delivery, then you forget about all the difficulties. And this one, we didn't really go through trouble because our colleagues were so accommodating. They all agreed immediately. And so I want to thank you again, and we thank Professor Boyce Davis for her contribution. And so that's it for today. And thank you all.
Thank you all for coming. Please keep coming to our parties. Without you, there is no party. So thank you also, and thanks so much.
Okay. Oh, thank you all.
Thank you.
It's really appreciated.